Hi, everybody. I'm Judge Glock. I'm a senior fellow and director of research at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. I'm very pleased today to have introduce and moderate this panel on Bidenomics and the cost of intervention. Before I start, just to set the stage and go a little bit further about what Raihan and Chairman McHenry talked about earlier, one of the things that's easy to forget is that President Biden came into office after one of the sharpest, but also one of the shortest recessions in modern memory. Part of that was you would think he would have a very positive political boost from overseeing a recovery. But all of us know that the defining economic story of Biden's presidency has been inflation that shot up almost immediately after he took office and shot up to the highest level of what we've seen in about 40 years. Now, Biden campaigned to a large extent as a moderate who would restore normalcy to the American presidency and to the government after what he characterized as the chaos of the Trump years. But surprisingly to many people, he actually oversaw one of the most activist economic policies in modern times that rivals in some sense the achievements of the Great Society or the New Deal in terms of its economic interventionism, in terms of its spending, in terms of its new regulatory policy. So although the administration has seen areas of very low unemployment, as the administration likes to emphasize, they have also seen an era of very high inflation, vast unprecedented levels of government spending, and new interventionist policies. Here today to talk about those issues with Bidenomics, the consequences and the effects of it, are three of my favorite commentators and speakers. First is Brian Riedl, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He was a former chief economist for Senator Rob Portman, and he served as director of budget for Marco Rubio's 2016 campaign. If any of you have followed the news recently, you have probably seen Brian commentating widely in many different forums and many different publications. Stephen Miran, over on my left over there, he's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a former senior advisor at the U.S. Treasury. He's published also widely in academic forums such as the American Economic Journal, the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, and elsewhere. And in the middle, right there, is Allison Schrager, also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. She is the author of a very fun but very serious book that I highly recommend to you, An Economist Walks into a Brothel, but also a regular contributor has been a regular contributor at The Economist and at Bloomberg. So if I could, I'd like to start with what may seem a little bit of an overbroad question, and that is, what do each of the panelists think is perhaps the most consequential economic decision of Biden's presidency? And Brian, if I could, start with you.
Thanks, Judge. I think the economic tone of this administration was really set in the first 50 days with the American Rescue Plan. If any of you held out hope that this administration would be moderate, prudent, bipartisan, care about deficits, maybe even listen to economists, the American Rescue Plan showed us that we were instead getting a highly political, partisan, and quite ideologically progressive administration. When Biden took office, there was so much stimulus already in the system and the economy was reopening, that the CBO said the economy was only $420 billion below capacity. So instead of dealing with that, Biden shot a $1.9 trillion bazooka at a $420 billion output gap, just weeks after a $900 billion stimulus. The economy clearly did not need this much stimulus, nor was it really about public health or COVID. Less than 5% of the spending was public health. Instead, we got $350 billion in bailouts for state budget deficits that didn't actually exist. We got a union pension bailout, big money for schools, unemployment bonuses, all greased with child credit and even more rebates. So economists across the spectrum warned this bill is too big and it's going to trigger inflation. And it wasn't just me and people on the right saying that. Larry Summers, Jason Furman from the left warned the administration that you are just going to spike inflation. But they got ignored for two reasons. First, there was a democratic narrative that had grown out of the Great Recession, that the Great Recession's recovery was held back by not enough stimulus and government spending. I think that was wrong, but that was the narrative. But second, because that bill became more about politics than about policy. Democrats refused to negotiate or even compromise 1 inch with Republicans because they saw this Christmas tree bill as their divine right reward for winning the election. Republicans had done a $2 trillion tax cut, and by golly, we're going to do a $2 trillion spending bill. So there would be no compromise. So the bill was signed on day 50 of the administration. And once again, the spending ended up being mostly unnecessary, especially the state bailouts, and inflation spiked further exactly as everyone predicted. And in fact, it's the furious backlash against this inflation that ultimately killed and shaped much of the rest of the fiscal policy under the Biden administration. Once this bill spiked inflation, the idea of a $2 to $3 trillion Build Back Better collapsed. The idea of new $1 trillion bills became a punchline. In fact, that inflation might cost Biden re-election. Just like the 70s inflation cost Jimmy Carter re-election, scarred a generation, and induced 4 decades of central bank fears. So really, again, the die was cast there.
And Stephen, if I can jump to you, what do you think was one of the most consequential? Because I know you've written a little bit about some of the follow-on policies that emerged after the American Rescue Plan and some of the subsequent statutes Biden helped pass.
Yeah, I actually kind of agree with Brian that sort of the advent of the pro-cyclical policy driving inflation is sort of the most consequential implication of Bidenomics. But inflation is sort of one consequence of pro-cyclical policy, but I want to emphasize another one which is less salient, which is that part of the reason why you don't do pro-cyclical policy is because it generates inflation, as Brian emphasized. Another reason why you don't do pro-cyclical policy is because you need fiscal space available when something bad happens, right? And in 2020, the pandemic came out of nowhere. Nobody really predicted the pandemic. It was this big external shock to the economy. And fortunately, policy had been reasonably prudent ahead of time, and there was tons of fiscal space in which to really prevent a Great Depression, right? We were able to prevent a second Great Depression because we had the fiscal space in which to do so. Right now, sort of it looks like things like bird flu is not going to turn into COVID, thank God, nobody wants that, right? But if you run a 7% deficit during a peacetime expansion, it's historically reckless, not only because it generates the type of inflation that Brian was just describing, but also because it leaves you with no fiscal space if something bad were to actually happen. If a real recession were to sort of come out of the woodwork now, the economy shrinks, revenues plummet, that 7% deficit that we're running now suddenly becomes 10, 11, 12%. And suddenly, if you have a big enough shock, bird flu does turn into COVID or something, you have very limited fiscal space in which to respond, right? And that's a big problem because that can really exacerbate events to the downside. So pro-cyclical fiscal policy is, to me, the hallmark of what we've been living through for the last few years. One side of it is inflation. The other side is the lurking risk of having limited space to respond to shocks in the future.
And Allison?
All of that, and I would also, anyway, it was smaller in scope and didn't cause the inflation that has still become the big deal to our economy and monetary policy is the CHIPS Act. Because I think that was a real break in sort of policy making that, Jake Sullivan last year had a speech where he declared the Washington consensus dead. And I think the CHIPS Act and what followed it really reflected industrial policy coming back in a big way. Something that I thought as an economist we weren't going to do anymore. And so it's really the government having a heavy hand in guiding the economy. And if you recall, in the early post-pandemic years, all these people were like, we just, they became more supply side focused, which I loved because I've always been someone who thinks that we need to think more carefully about the supply side and what we make and being more efficient with that. But they somehow had this misguided idea that we could have more efficient outcomes from the supply side if the government picked winners, which has never gone well. And I am somewhat heartened that all of these even sort of left-wing champions of this idea are like, oh, gee, well, I didn't realize that there'd be all these environmental restrictions on what we could do, delaying it, or that would have to hire more expensive labor if the government did the project. But I don't think that, commentators are doing that. I don't think the government has really internalized that. Especially, I don't see anyone on the horizon being like, well, gee, maybe we shouldn't direct resources, capital, and honestly, human capital. I wrote a column last week citing a survey that new college graduates more and more are aspiring to work in manufacturing and in government. Like the two big sectors that this administration is trying to grow. So it's not just financial capital that ends up getting distorted when you have big industrial policy. It's human capital too. And I think, as Chairman McHenry pointed out, that these subsidies are effectively permanent. They're very hard to roll back. So even if we try in the future, we're sort of stuck with this industrial policy. And I think it's a real big shift in a philosophy of economic policy making that I thought had gone. And I'm feeling nostalgic for the 90s now when we had the Clinton administration really believing in markets, and it feels like we've lost that.
Well, yeah, those of us who remember the time when we were all very concerned about 1 or 2 or 3% of GDP peacetime budget deficits now look back in absolute admiration relative to a 7% of GDP peacetime deficit. So this is building, maybe this next question is building off a little bit of what Allison mentioned, but obviously for the first 2 years of Biden's term, he had a very sympathetic Congress that, as our panelists have discussed, allowed him to pass these very massive interventionist bills. I mean, does anyone feel free to jump in here, think there was something distinctive about these bills? Was it this industrial policy animation, like this ideology behind it? Was it something to do with whether or not they could be involved in direct planning? What does anyone feel is distinctive here?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Well, to me, the theme of the first 2 years was unions and industrial policy. Unions, we have seen so much has been based on strengthening unions. There was a big push on minimum wage. There was project labor agreements, Davis-Bacon, Buy America. And in fact, this push was so aggressive by the Biden administration that they completely stepped on their bigger stated goal of fighting inflation. President Biden would say, my #1 domestic priority is fighting inflation. But whenever his anti-inflation agenda conflicted with unions, whether it be with tariffs, the Jones Act, project labor agreements, again, Davis-Bacon, he always chose unions and labor over fighting inflation. And beyond unions, there's also, of course, so much picking winners and losers. There's so much industrial policy going on. Kind of a government as busybody picking winners and losers that as was stated earlier, we thought this stuff was defeated in the 90s. These ideas were old. But if I look at themes, I see government picking winners and losers and a president who came from labor always prioritizing labor over the higher stated goal of fighting inflation.
Yeah, and on that, I think what strikes me is I think we're like in a real sort of new economic era that we didn't have to live with for the last, say, 30, 40 years of really we can make a lot of policy without a lot of trade-offs. But I think that time is gone. Like where interest rates are going up, we've got a lot of debt, inflation is now back, and it's even if it goes down, it's sort of now in people's minds, so it more easily comes back. And I would say this government is still behaving as if there are no trade-offs, as if debt is costless, as if you can steer economic activity to something you find politically favorable, and there are no costs to that. So I think it is, just sort of a complete belief that you can do whatever you want, and there are no costs to it.
Yeah, and that's really the MMT ideology infiltrating and sort of becoming so dominant among parts of the left, right? This belief that, as they say, deficits don't matter, sort of becoming dominant because we had really no inflation for about a decade, And combined with, I think, economists being sidelined in a lot of the economic policy making of the Biden administration, combined with that view, led to these, what I think were very bad decisions being made.
I think Brian has joked a little bit about the economists in the basement of the White House being tortured because every time the Biden administration releases a new EO or announcement about price gouging or evil corporations and profit inflation and so forth, those sort of ideas are the ones we thought maybe we had left behind years ago, but here they've seen an efflorescence again. So to Brian, maybe to go to you on this next one, one of the most surprising things, at least to me, during the Biden administration is how much they've been able to use unilateral executive action to accomplish ends that seem core congressional powers, the power of the purse, of course. I mean, this has been a big deal, despite for having for a long period a fairly sympathetic Congress. They've done a lot directly through the presidential action, and do you think that's been consequential in a way that hasn't been clear in previous presidencies, at least on the spending side?
You know, absolutely. I think we've been seeing this coming for several administrations. I mean, you always expect presidents to grab whatever power they can. And it used to be the case that Congress would get angry and pull it back. I mean, the 74 Budget Act was originally the 74, Budget and Impoundment Act that was trying to rein in President Nixon doing impoundment. But over time, each president continues to try to grab more power, as we usually expect, and especially it really accelerated Bush, then Obama, then Trump. But now Congress actually doesn't assert itself anymore. Congress says, hey, as long as the president's doing it on my team, let the president assert as much power as he or she wants. And what we've seen is an insane student loan bailout that was so huge and unconstitutional, the Supreme Court had to jump in. Hundreds of billions of dollars of unilateral, executive-driven spending expansions for SNAP and for health care, where the administration just cut out Congress and added spending by hundreds of billions. Again, you've seen aggressive tariffs, Buy America, Davis-Bacon expansions, ethanol expansions, NEPA regulations against building and infrastructure. We have seen a very aggressive White House grabbing all the power it can in many ways in which to hamstring the economy and increase deficits. And while we kind of expect presidents to do it, again, the two changes are A, just how brazen it's become. I mean, the student loan stuff was insane. But second, Congress really isn't reasserting itself or fighting back like they used to, because it used to be the case, the old joke in Congress used to be that the other party is the opposition, but the White House is the enemy. That's what they used to tell each other in Congress. Now it's, hey, as long as the White House is my party, take as much power as you want.
And we've definitely obviously seen more increase in unilateral presidential action from both parties and both administrations when they've come into power. But again, similar to sort of the scale being different during the Biden administration, I think I saw recently the total new regs imposed by the Biden administration were about $1.5 trillion, which is multiples of the cost even during the Obama administration during the first term. Stephen, I know you've written a little bit about this kind of regulatory impulse of the Biden administration, the effects of that. Do you think this is both distinctive and larger than earlier ones, and does it bode a new era?
I mean, yeah, I think it is distinctive and larger than regulations of earlier administrations, and I think that the stakes are now much higher too. In the last 10 years, a consensus has emerged that one of the major, if not the major, questions of the 21st century is the geopolitical, competition with China, and who is going to be the leader of the 21st century, and are we going to be able to maintain our, retain our middle class? Well, that becomes a lot harder if you make it expensive to produce stuff in America. Every regulation adds to the cost of doing business. It adds to the cost of production. It adds to the cost of making things. And in many cases, these regulations explicitly raise the cost of production by raising the cost of inputs. And so Brian mentioned Davis-Bacon requirements, right? There are many regulations imposed by the administration and sometimes written into the statutes or the laws of the main Bidenomics programs that require companies taking subsidies from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, from the Inflation Reduction Act, from the CHIPS Act, to observe what are called prevailing wage requirements, which basically make unions wage setters. And they basically prevent firms from competing on labor costs, from competing on reducing the cost of building something in order to take the government subsidy, right? That just raises the cost of doing business. And these types of requirements are really run throughout the Bidenomics programs. They range from things like requiring a ton of features in cars to reduce emissions, things like requiring cars to have automatic shutoff if they're idling. Everything like, there's dozens of things like that, and every single one of them makes it more expensive to build something, right? Every time you make it more expensive to build something, every time you make it more expensive to use American labor, to use American factories, you're making America less competitive. And China doesn't care about that stuff, right? They don't care about any of that stuff. And so they will come into export markets and they will undercut you because their price of making stuff is lower because they don't have, some regulations are necessary, right? We don't want to, we have a lot of regulations that are important, but so many of them are absolutely unnecessary and serve no function but to raise the cost of making stuff here. And I think it's a major problem insofar as we want to prioritize issues in the 21st century, like the competition with China.
Yeah, I think many of us here have talked about and would agree that one of the fundamental sort of visions or aspects of Bidenomics has been to subsidize demand and restrict supply, which is exactly the opposite of what most economists would recommend to do. And that obviously has been to some extent contributing to inflation. Allison, how much would you say of the recent inflation could be laid at the feet of Bidenomics and the Biden administration in particular versus cyclical issues with the recovery, the Federal Reserve, or these other issues that obviously they inherited or have to deal with because of the nature of the current Federal Reserve?
Well, when inflation was at its peak, I think the estimates were like 2-3 percentage points was due to expansionary policy, largely expansionary fiscal policy. And the rest was, post-pandemic supply-related issues. And since then, I think the post-pandemic supply-related issues have largely been resolved. But I think it's worth reflecting on why is inflation still high? And still like giving the Fed now actually sort of a real test of its mettle. And, really is once inflation gets entrenched in the economy, it's very hard to get rid of. And so I think it's worth sort of laying some blame on sort of, one, the fact we still are in expansionary fiscal policy mode, which, as you pointed out, even left-wing economists are pointing out is adding to demand. I mean, the whole purpose of what monetary policy is supposed to be doing is decreasing demand, but that's being undermined by fiscal policy that's adding to demand. And I think the real danger here is, we get 3.5% inflation for like a good couple of years, then all of a sudden that becomes almost self-fulfilling and people bake that into the wage contracts. And certainly, with the Biden administration really pushing to have, higher wages, then that becomes sort of like our new normal inflation. And so, while I do think it was largely, most of the inflation initially was pandemic related and the expansionary policy just made it worse, I think we can start to sort of blame it more now for the inflation that's being so persistent. And
just to maybe push you on that a little bit, has just the nature of the very expansive fiscal policy just made the Federal Reserve's job harder, or has the Federal Reserve also been behind the curve and also failed to deal with the inflation?
They were initially behind the curve. I don't think they are now. I mean, you can quibble with how restrictionist they are being, but I think they're definitely on the side of being restrictionist. But as I said, their job is largely undermined, one, by the fact that we're still sort of goosing demand on the fiscal side, and also, we are running these enormous debts. And that also can be inflationary. And it also ties the Fed's hands in the future in terms of their independence of if we end up in a situation where we have very high interest, where it's harder for them to raise interest rates when we have a lot of debt. And that honestly, I think, is really even more than the sort of theatrics Trump is putting out with what can really be undermining to Fed independence.
And if I can just add quickly on that just to give a quick sample of kind of the backwards economic policy going on in the White House on this, related to prices, inflation, and interest rates. Many of us have lived the fact that in the last couple of years, the mortgage of a median priced home has doubled since President Biden took office. If you take into effect higher interest rates and the higher price of housing, the just median mortgage on a median priced home has doubled. What's the White House's response to this policy? Well, first, they pursue even more inflationary policies in the economy on spending and regulation that just force the Fed to raise interest rates even higher. Because the harder Biden presses the gas, the higher the Fed has to hit the brake. But then the White House unveils a $10,000 tax credit for buying housing, which is just going to raise demand more. So their own policies are to drive up interest rates further by being so counter-cyclical with fiscal policy against it, and then subsidizing demand. So of course things just get worse. And this is why economists kind of pull their hair out.
And a lot of this is done by unilateral action of the type you were describing before. So if you think about the Inflation Reduction Act and sort of the attempt to build out electric vehicles throughout the country, whether or not people sort of want them in the absence of subsidies, the Biden administration has stretched definition after definition just to get as many dollars out the door as possible, which on the one hand raises the deficit, on the other hand stokes more demand into the country. And so, for example, they redefined luxury sedans into SUVs so that people buying $75,000 Cadillacs could benefit from $7,500 taxpayer subsidies for buying EVs, right? Somebody buying an almost $80,000 Cadillac doesn't probably need, sort of a tenth of the cost covered, roughly a tenth of the cost covered by the taxpayer, throwing that demand into the economy. They redefined trade agreements, in a way that really, really angered Senator Manchin, right? So that parts from China could be included in, in various parts and vehicles being subsidized, and the battery components and so forth. And time after time, they will change definitions to create loopholes just to funnel dollars into the economy, whether in the IRA, whether through the student loan debacle that Brian described before, all in an attempt to just keep demand strong, and which also, sort of thereby keeps inflation strong. And a lot of it is language games, and a lot of it is unilateral action.
One of the things I know Brian too, and some of the others on the panel have written about, is the vicious cycle that started. That the inflationary demand has driven up interest rates, which has also driven up the cost to the government, which has driven up the deficit, which leads to more borrowing, et cetera. Brian, I think what are the most recent numbers about what interest on the federal debt is going to cost us this year? Do you know roundabouts how big it is, or as percentage of the?
It was about $330 billion a couple of years ago, and now it's heading between $800 and $1 trillion. By the end of the decade, depending on what happens with the tax cuts in the economy, interest could be $2 trillion a year by the end of the decade, the biggest expenditure in the government outside of Social Security. And by that point, 25% of your federal taxes will just go to paying interest on the debt.
Well, that might be a good jump to my next question, which is, what are the long-term consequences of Bidenomics? Like I said at the beginning, a lot of people thought this might be a moderate economic administration, thought it wouldn't change many things, would basically continue the long-term consensus, maybe tweak some of the Trump administration policies. But are we going to see a fundamental shift in economic policy, similar to what we saw maybe after the Great Society or after the New Deal? And Brian, obviously, one of you think you mentioned the long-term effects is just going to be dealing with the deficit. And do you think there's anyone else think other long-term effects that we're going to have to wrestle with? How much of this is going to change in the near term, no matter who wins or has to change?
Yeah, I'll bite. So as I said before, I think the most, one of the most important questions of the century is the competition with China, and we have precious little time in which to really make an effort at maintaining our international supremacy and sort of maintaining our manufacturing sector and our middle class. And to the extent that we've spent the last 4 years making American manufacturing, American activity, American building expensive by overregulation, and to the extent that we haven't really done much to make America the best place in the world to invest, hire, work. We've given the Chinese time in which to continue building up their state-subsidized export engines and try and take more and more additional markets. And so if you look at what's going on in the auto industry now, sort of China went from being a non-existent, sort of player in the international auto export market a few years ago to now being, sort of the biggest exporter, all of a sudden, right, in the last 9 months or so, last 12 months. We have eroded our fiscal space. Right, we have maintained in expensive currency. We have regulated our economy into sort of being uncompetitive, and we have not taken advantage of the precious little time that we have to compete with China.
Brian or Allison?
Well, I think what worries me, as I said, is this shift in philosophy of what the government is for and their role. Because we're also seeing this of elements in the right too, of this idea that the government should have a heavy hand in guiding what industries are growing, whether it's regulating AI, whether it's reviving manufacturing. And, as you point out, like once you go down that road and put in a lot of subsidies and people have jobs around it, it's really hard to get rid of that. It's hard to just be like, oh, no, we're going to go back to neoliberalism now. These things are persistent. I mean, we obviously things from the Great Society we still have. So once you give someone a benefit, it's really hard to get rid of it.
Yeah, and I would just add more briefly that I think one of the legacies, again, of the Biden administration is furthering this view that on a fiscal basis, we can increase spending for everybody, we can give everybody all of these benefits, and either we can just ignore the cost, or we can say the rich will pay for the whole thing. So we've kind of, again, furthered these expectations of free lunch economics that is completely outside of political and economic reality. I mean, just a couple days ago, the president's Twitter account, I'm not going to say the president, I don't think the president knows what Twitter is. The president's Twitter account said that we're going to finance the entire Social Security and Medicare shortfall by taxing the rich. Well, the Social Security and Medicare shortfall is $124 trillion over 30 years. It's 11% of GDP per year within 3 decades. The idea that you could close that by taxing the rich is so mathematically fantastical, it's a joke. I mean, yes, taxing the rich is part of it. But again, when the White House says things like, Build Back Better will cost nothing, and those under 400,000 won't pay a penny in taxes, even as we expand Social Security, Medicare, and give everybody these benefits, you're creating perceptions that are going to be really hard for subsequent lawmakers and politicians to rein back in.
So that is actually perfectly segueing into my next question as well, in that how much of this can be undone? You know, Allison talked about the political constituencies are there. Brian talked about like a lot of these deficits are baked in. The ideology is in there now. The constituencies are getting ever louder about demanding these sort of benefits. I mean, can this be undone, or is it going to be the classic situation of we'll do the right thing after all the alternatives are exhausted, and we need a fiscal crisis, an interest rate crunch, which already appears to be happening, for actually people to change course?
Well, what's extraordinary is Biden's administration keeps giving people money, yet people hate his economic policy. I mean, maybe obviously because of the inflation, but and I think people sort of sense there's some sort of connection there. So I think, yeah, if we had someone came in who could actually deliver growth and low inflation again, that, people, might be open to it. Because I said, like, he keeps giving handouts and people keep saying he's the worst ever for the economy.
Anyone else? No, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can sort of take the approach of trying to expand the, so the Biden administration likes to use this expression, new supply side economics, which basically just means subsidizing sectors of the economy they like and trying to pick winners and losers. I think that you can have some actual supply side reform where you actually make it easy to invest, easy to hire, easy to make stuff here. And then, you can sort of get the economy booming in a non-inflationary way because supply can dynamically and easily adjust to meet demand.
I'll just say, just to beat my hobby horse on this, it is undeniably the case that losing between 4 to 8 years to address Social Security, Medicare, and deficits, getting 4 years closer to Social Security and Medicare Part A's insolvency, and having the debt rise rapidly over these is going to make the inevitable solution more painful. I mean, ultimately, the government has promised more than the economy and tax system will ever be able to deliver. That's just a mathematical fact. And the longer we wait and the more interest rates go up in the process, the more debt gets baked into the cake, your taxes are going to be raised more than they would have been had we addressed this earlier. Your benefits are going to be cut more than they would have been had we addressed this earlier. That's just the hard economic reality of not only losing these years, but actually going backwards in the debt over these years.
And somewhat amazingly doing that while actually having incredibly unpopular economic policy, as Allison said. Amazing to spend that much, to provide that many handouts to many favored constituencies and still have massive majorities of people think it was a failed program. And Chairman McHenry mentioned in the last, the recent moves with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I've written recently about how Freddie has proposed adding what may be about $1 trillion to consumer spending through a new second mortgage proposal. Absolutely astounding, considering the current situation and the polling around inflation, but that seems to be what they want to double down on. So this would be a more hypothetical question than most of those we've engaged in, but can we or should we expect something different from a second Biden term if he beats the current polling and odds and wins again in November? Will he have to change course? Do you see any odds of that or likelihood of that? Brian?
I mean, it so much depends on outside factors. The first is the control of Congress. If Democrats win back a trifecta, I think they're going to try very hard to get the band back together and spend like the first 2 years. They might find the voters are less enthusiastic now that we're in an inflation and high interest rate environment, but they're going to try to get the band back together. If the Republicans hold the House or the Senate, really neither side has much desire to talk. Not much is going to happen legislatively, which is normal, to be honest, for presidential second terms. Much is also going to depend on the economy. Is there a debt crisis? Is there a recession? Does inflation keep rising? What happens in Taiwan and Ukraine? But there's going to be probably as little legislative progress as possible, even as Social Security heads to insolvency. I'll also add, at the end of his next term, President Biden is going to be 85 years old. So there is a legitimate question of how in control of policy the president's even going to be at that point relative to his staff in the White House. And I know, that there's a lot of talk and a lot of stories about the outsized influence certain staffers and policy advisors have in the Biden White House because the president is a little less in control due to his age than another president might be. So the direction of the second term, we might see more empowerment of, frankly, whatever hobby horse the staff is on. I mean, for instance, we heard a lot that one of the reasons the president moved so aggressively on the student loan bailout, which he didn't really campaign on, is because he had a lot of younger 30-year-old staffers who had big student loans in the White House. So you never know. What are the staffers going to think up next?
And I would say that although I have concerns about being governed by Biden or others, that there's no one I would less like to be governed by than 30-year-old White House staffers. But I guess that's what I'm going to have to endure at least for a little bit longer. Allison?
Yeah, I think it largely depends on, again, who's in Congress, although I guess we've seen with executive action that's actually not that big a constraint. And as I said, who's in his administration? I mean, generally, you kind of get the B team in the second administration, so it could be even worse. I mean, we were talking on the phone about how what we've seen is, starting with Trump, but much more with Biden, is a sort of marginalization of economists in terms, like it does seem that his economic policy is largely being sort of generated, and the philosophy is done by lawyers now. Especially because there was sort of a fashion that we were going to, use economic policy as diplomacy, which always sort of horrified economists. So I don't see like top tier. He didn't have a lot of top tier economists in the first administration, and generally, if you don't have them in the first administration, you're not going to have them in their second administration. So to the extent that he's largely going to be driven by advisors and also doesn't have to run for re-election, then I imagine it could be just a lot more of the same.
I'd say that the lesson that the Biden administration took away from the 2022 midterms, when, remember, inflation was even more salient in 2022 than it is now. I think that the lesson that a lot of them took away was that voters may hate inflation, but it turns out that, at least in the lesson of 2022, they didn't predominantly vote based on it. And they voted based on, cultural issues and other stuff, that non-economic issues that was sort of big news items at the time. And I think that that's how a lot of them sort of just think now as a result of the last election cycle. And therefore, I think that if we do get a second term for President Biden, I would expect them to just keep doing the same, right? Like they, like they think it's working. They don't seem to care about sort of long-term fiscal sustainability. They think that inflation is, generally speaking, something that is a messaging issue and not an actual material economic issue. It's that you're not looking at the data correctly, or you don't understand this is all going to be in the rearview mirror lately, or you're confused about the economy. It's never like a legitimate concern. It's always just a messaging issue. And if they get another term, the takeaway again will be that voters will say that they're unhappy with inflation, but hey, they voted us back into office, so we're just going to keep doing the same thing.
Give them more money.
Yeah, exactly. Let's give them more money. Yeah.
You don't think, nobody thinks we're going to face the fiscal crisis that's going to require an accounting on this, although obviously these things are impossible to predict. I mean, maybe the interest rates costing the government debt costing $800+ billion a year.
I don't think we get a fiscal crisis yet. I mean, I think the fact is, like, people still want to buy U.S. bonds enough, and there's certainly enough regulation that forces a lot of other intermediaries to do that, that interest rates go high, but they don't get to like financial crisis level high, certainly not in the next 4 years.
But it is inevitable at some point.
Yes, not ruling
You don't
it
want to
out.
say it's not going to happen.
No,
It's going to happen.
just in the next 4 years.
But
Unless it comes from non-economic means, right? So, the various Cold Wars around the world get hotter, and we're sort of, and there's a new strain on the budget that takes the deficit. Again, this is why I was saying before, 7% deficit and peacetime expansion. What if there's a war? What do you do then? Do you run a 15% deficit, right? That's a problem. So, there could be some sort of shock, presumably non-economic in nature, which induces a fiscal crisis, but there's not likely to be an endogenous economic shock from within the economic system.
And as you pointed out, we have a lot less fiscal space to deal with it now.
Exactly. Well, I think that this is a good time to open up for a Q&A. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to pose to the panelists?
Sure. David Jimenez with Niskanen. Maybe to end with a spirit of charity. What is one thing that the administration has done that you do think is genuinely pro-supply side in your understanding of that term?
So I'll be somewhat generous. I mean, I really am against all the, trade stuff, but I do think that we became aware during the pandemic that how vulnerable we were to the Chinese economy. For instance, they were making like a lot of our antibiotics. I mean, I don't think that means we don't trade and we revert to autarky. I think that just shows we shouldn't be dependent on any one country. So I think making us less dependent on that one country is actually, a good policy.
I guess if I had to find some positives for the Biden economic record, I mean, I kind of have to broaden out a little bit and say I do think the standing up and funding Ukraine not only is good as defense policy, but I also think it actually as fiscal policy. It's a lot cheaper to spend $60 billion now than $1 trillion later if Russia's on the march. The president did sign into law the Fiscal Responsibility Act, even if it was kicking and screaming. And I would also add, I think finally, grading on a curve. While the president's trade policies have been very disappointing, he's not in Trump's league in terms of being anti-trade and tariff. So I think if you're judging a president purely on trade policy, you could say, okay, as bad as Biden is on this, he has resisted the excesses of Trumpism on trade. He's not calling for a 10% global tariff. So I'm kind of grading on a curve, but I'll give him that.
Yeah, sure. Just to take the other side of what Brian said, I thought that President Biden was going to come in and get rid of all the tariffs on China, and they've been retained largely, and so I'm pleased with that. I'm very focused on the competition with China, but sort of more broadly, I think that a focus on infrastructure is a good thing. Sort of, we need some infrastructure in this country, right? But I think that so the idea was in the right place in that. But I think, as Allison said before, it was totally mangled by not realizing that if you don't actually take steps to make building infrastructure affordable, then you can't afford it. And if it's going to cost billions of dollars to build, like a mile of subway or whatever, I'm sorry, it's just we just can't afford to, do that. We have to take steps to make. If we're going to have, we need infrastructure, but if we're going to have infrastructure, we need to take steps to make it within our means to do so. And we didn't do that.
Any other questions out there?
Allison, you've said that we should retire the phrase higher for longer in favor of higher forever. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about that and where you see things settling.
Well, I think just structurally we're in for higher interest rates. I think the last 10 years was somewhat of an anomaly, this sort of zero rate environment. And some of it is just, older population, maybe a pullback from trade. And sort of, as I said, these sort of higher debts just mean that structurally we end up with higher interest rates, even if the Fed decides to, I saw a woman on this morning claiming the next year they're going to cut 200 basis points, even if that happened. I worry more about the longer end of the curve, because that really is what often matters more for consumers. And I think, ultimately that comes down largely to the term premium, that it is a function of sort of our fiscal stance. It is a function of how much we're trading and all these sorts of things. Because ultimately when we do have higher inflation, we have more inflation uncertainty, and both those things contribute to higher interest rates. So even they can do all they want, but it's going to be really, really hard to get mortgage rates down to what they ever were. I mean, I don't think they're ever going to get down to what they ever were because, I mean, this is more of I think this is actually the biggest, nothing to do with the Biden administration, the biggest monetary policy era that we had. It wasn't that there were late inflation, although that was definitely an error. It was the fact that, like, even as late as 2022, the Fed was buying every mortgage-backed security on the market, even when there was like bidding wars going on all over the country. And so now we have all of these people who have super cheap mortgages, and that's just going to cause a distortion in the housing market for years to come.
Let me just quickly jump into, or maybe not as quickly, on how, since you bring up interest rates, something that I have written about extensively is how exposed the federal debt is on interest rates. Right now, the CBO, if you use a current policy baseline, has the debt going to 234% of GDP in 30 years. That's a current policy baseline. Tax cuts are extended, discretionary spending stays. You go up to 234% of GDP. It had historically been about 40. It just went up to 100. You go up to 234, blows away almost the whole world. Those numbers assume that the interest rate paid on the national debt never again exceeds 3.8%, ever. Okay? Well, the latest sales of debt are about 4.5% to 5% right now. And if interest rates rise, every point they rise adds $35 trillion in interest costs over 30 years. That's per point. How much is that? That's the cost of adding another Defense Department. So if rates are 4.8 instead of 3.8, add another Defense Department. If rates go to 5.8, add 2 Defense Departments. Then you have the debt going to 350% of GDP. You have deficits going to 20% of GDP. The sad reality is that your lawmakers have gambled our long-term fiscal policy on the hope that interest rates never reach 4% ever again. I'm not sure that's what was the best bet.
As an inveterate optimist, I can always trust Brian to bring me back down to earth again. Stephen, did you?
How could I possibly follow that? I don't even remember what the question was now.
At that point.
Interest rates, inflation.
Yeah, now we're all just mulling on our mortgage future. And as someone who recently was house shopping, I was just mocked mercilessly by my friends who got mortgages back in 2020 or 2021. It's brutal, brutal in comparison. Yes, any other questions out there?
I think we put him to sleep.
Okay, well with that, I would like you all to thank the panelists up there. Thank you.